Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Yesterday, President Biden spent 8 hours in Israel. Today, we ask, what is the likely impact of his visit both on Israel as well as the Middle East? Joining me for this discussion is India's former ambassador to Israel and the United States, and also India's former High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, Navtej Sarna. Mr. Sarna, let me start with the question that is probably at the top of everyone's mind. Has the Biden visit to Israel reduced the chances of the Hamas-Israel conflict spreading through the region, exacerbated it, or made little impact either way?
Well, I think at the moment it looks like the visit itself is not going to be critical in what happens next. I think what are the lessons that will come out of the visit, particularly two aspects. One is that President Biden, in his remarks, warned against big mistakes and said rage should not become a policy in Israel's follow-up or excessive rage. And I think his intention was to advise Israel that while they do go in for a ground offensive, it should be a very calculated ground offensive. Which would minimize civilian deaths and have clear military objectives. And the second aspect is that he said humanitarian aid pathways should open up. Now, both these things remain to be seen, how they go. And frankly, I think the chances of escalation or the prospects of escalation will depend entirely on how the ground offensive goes.
Let's come to some of the points you made in a moment's time. First, let me talk about the fact that the Jordan summit didn't happen. As you know, Biden was supposed to meet the president of Egypt, the president of Palestine, and the king of Jordan. But first, Mahmoud Abbas cancelled it, and then King Abdullah cancelled it as well. Clearly, they were upset, if not annoyed, by the Gaza hospital killings, and possibly also by the fact that Israel is insisting that this was the responsibility of Islamic Jihad, not the Israelis. Whilst he was on Israeli soil, Biden went to endorse the Israeli claim. Would that have further annoyed the Arab leaders and added further to their concern?
Well, you know, the first news that came out of the hospital bombing made it look like it was an IDF attack. And there was an immediate reaction across the Arab world. And there were protests in the streets. And of course, the leaders had to express their anger. And I think the cancellation of the Jordan summit was a very clear statement of that. The endorsement of Israel's position by President Biden came later. And thereafter, there have been some announcements, even from the National Security Council, saying that based on preliminary assessments and intelligence gathering, it does not look like an IDF strike. Now, be that as it may, the fact is that so many people being killed in one incident is in a state of escalation of the war. Causes a lot of anger in across the various countries, And that's what's happened.
Absolutely. And that I don't deny. But will the endorsement by Biden and by the National Security Council spokesperson further exacerbate the sense of hurt and grievance that the Arab leaders felt because they then called off the summit? Or will it make them realize that perhaps we made a mistake? We were a bit impetuous. We should have met Biden. Which way will that endorsement go?
No, I don't think it will mean that we should have met Biden. I think Biden's position, with or without the hospital bombing, was more or less expected. He was going to Israel to express support for Israel's positions. It was only the small takeaways that the Palestinians or the Palestinian supporters in other countries could have looked to. So I don't think that particular endorsement is going to be a major relevant factor one way or the other, because this is going to be ultimately a factual thing. Sooner or later, somebody is going to come up with a definitive assessment as to what kind of a strike it was.
Okay, let's then focus a little bit more closely on what Biden said and did during those 8 hours that he was in Israel. Before he arrived in Tel Aviv, Biden had on several occasions said Israel must observe the rules of war. Blinken separately but repeatedly spoke about ensuring that civilian casualties were at a minimum. But when Biden was actually on Israeli soil, that message was less emphatically stated. What he said, worse still, was drowned out by a promise of unprecedented military arms for Israel. Now, we don't know what he said behind closed doors, but do you fear that he's given some sort of green light to Netanyahu to carry on with the Israeli ground invasion, which Israel is clearly preparing for?
Well, I would like to think that there would be a public stance and there would be a private conversations. And I think the public stance was an unstinted support for Israel, meeting the hostages' families and pressing all the right buttons, which is absolutely in line with the United States position of unstinted support to Israel. But I'm sure from some of the things that he said in his statement, comparing it to 15 9/11s and comparing it to the mistakes that were made earlier, and his earlier statement that a ground offensive could result in a catastrophe, I think my guess is there would have been private conversations advising restraint, because ultimately an unrestrained ground offensive is not good for Israel itself. Forget about anything else.
I take your point, but there is a significant measure of difference between saying Israel must observe the rules of war, which he said in front of Jewish leaders in Washington, which he said to CBS in 60 Minutes, and what he said in Israel, which is simply, don't be consumed by rage. That is not just a milder, more euphemistic way of putting it, but don't be consumed by rage also permits a ground offensive of a limited nature to happen, which could still end up causing civilian lives.
Absolutely. I don't think he ruled out the ground offensive. I don't think there was any clear signal advising no ground offensive. It seemed to be ground offensive, yes, but. Okay. And I think that is the way it's going to be. He's speaking to a different audience, you see. There's tremendous rage in Israel. There's tremendous anger in Israel over the kind of atrocities committed by Hamas. So he's speaking here to a different audience. And the Israelis are saying that they are following rules of law. Now, people would differ with this. But that's what they're saying technically. So ultimately, it's going to be facts on the ground. How many civilian deaths? How much is the collateral damage? And how much anger does it cause or puts pressure on people like the Hezbollah to then start coming in as support? So far, they have been restrained, and so far they have held back.
So what you're suggesting,
crossfire.
So what you're suggesting Biden has indicated that a certain measure of civilian deaths, a certain measure of collateral damage is going to be acceptable to America, provided it's within restraint. Don't do it excessively. That's what he means by don't be consumed by rage.
I think that is the subtext, where he won't say that a certain number of civilian casualties, but he He seems to have indicated that, yes, if you feel a ground offensive is absolutely necessary, then please, you will go ahead, but make sure that, it does not get out of hand and it has clear military strategic objectives. And that, frankly, I think that's what Israel must be mulling over themselves, because that's why they've been waiting 3 or 4 days before going in.
Now, there are, as you know, 2 American aircraft carriers with their supporting ships in the Mediterranean. And we also know that some 2,000 American soldiers have been placed on what's called deployed command. Will that deter Iran and Hezbollah, both of whom have talked of their readiness to intervene? Both of them have spoken about it on multiple occasions. Or will it, in fact, far from deter them, possibly provoke them?
No, I think it is a deterrent. Hezbollah itself is not particularly keen to enter this war. I mean, if Hezbollah had come in on October 7, then this would have been a very different situation. So what they have done is, there's been occasional crossfire exchanged, rockets have been fired, a reaction has been had from the Israeli side, but this is kind of token support for Hamas. They've really not come in. They don't want to upset the balance which has been established since 2006. And I think the aircraft carrier's presence is very much both a deterrent and also, if Hezbollah does come in and the US begins strikes, then you have, a dog's breakfast.
Now, the other big issue Biden said he would address is humanitarian aid for the people of Gaza. After his departure, Israel announced that they had agreed to permit humanitarian aid for Gaza through the Rafah crossing, provided Hamas doesn't share it and provided the trucks coming in can be inspected. Biden also promised separately $100 million worth of humanitarian aid for Gaza directly from the United States. So does this mean that we will see a discernible improvement in the status and situation facing the Gazan people? And from their point of view, is this a significant improvement?
Well, it all depends on how it goes, because, Israel has put 3 conditions on the aid going in. One is that no aid from Israeli territory until the hostages are released. The second is that Red Cross must get access to the hostages. And the third is the inspections that you mentioned, that it should be food, electricity, and medicines, food, water, and medicines, and should only go to people in South Gaza or those heading there, and should not go to Hamas. Now, these are valid conditions from Israel's point of view, but they certainly will result in, how quickly the aid goes in will depend on how quickly these conditions can be handled. At the moment, from what I read, there are lines of trucks outside Rafah, and the aid has not gone in. I don't think...
Biden has announced, forgive me interrupting, that the aid will start coming in on Friday. The reason the aid cannot go earlier because the Egyptians have told him that the roads are in a poor condition and need to be repaired. But initially, it will be only 20 trucks going in. We don't know after that first 20 whether there will be more to follow or not.
Yes, so it all depends. It's just not going to be a turnkey thing that once they have agreed, aid is going and all is going to be hunky-dory. There is huge amounts of aid lying at El Arish Airport, which is only 28 kilometers away from Rafah. But, how quickly it gets to people and how quickly, it can be cleared through Rafah, which is, after all, a small crossing, which is, there's no level of trust there between Egypt and Israel at the moment.
And the other thing you're pointing out is that this aid, if it does go in, and even if it goes in small numbers, 20 trucks and no more, is limited to South Gaza. According to the BBC, there are still some 400,000 to 500,000 Gazans in the north who have not come down south. They will not get any aid. They will not be recipients of this.
Well, this is the condition that the emergency cabinet of Israel put forward after the Biden visit.
Now, the third issue Blinken this time identified before Biden reached Israel was the hostage issue. Biden, on the other hand, when he was on Israel's soil, refused to talk about the hostage issue. So does that mean that all the earlier speculation, both by the New York Times as well as by the American television channel NBC, that there could be a release of hostages in return for Israel stopping the airstrikes. That remains speculation. There's no further movement that we know of, at least in the public domain.
I think that was a lot of wishful thinking. The hostages release will be done, if it is done, when it is done, through very protracted back channel negotiations, as I'm sure are already going on. The Israeli airstrikes are not ending at the moment. In fact, you're sitting at the edge of a possible ground offensive. So all this is up in the air. What he did do during his visit, and I think that was very important for Israel, was to meet the families of the hostages, to express his sympathy with them. And I think that has left a very good feeling about President Biden in Israel.
Now, so far, we've talked about the things that the president said, the things that he's done, as well as far as the hostage situation is concerned, what he refused to talk about. Let's for a moment come to the personal message he gave by his behavior when he arrived at the airport and warmly embraced Netanyahu, and also by the manner in which he spoke with Netanyahu thereafter. One of the things that came through very strongly during those 8 hours was Biden's personal and emotional support for Israel. It clearly dominated his final address. But could it, in fact, also worry the Arab leaders like the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians and Qataris, and perhaps Mahmoud Abbas most of all? Because in their eyes, it might suggest that this American president is a little bit too one-sided and partisan than even they expected he would be. He clearly needs these Arabs on his side if he's going to ever hope to push through a new Middle East agenda with a Saudi-Israel deal. Has he been a little bit too partisan in his personal conduct?
Well, I frankly think that the Biden administration has had its eyes off the ball on the Middle East, essential problem of the Middle East, for far too long. They have been trying what has been called by Netanyahu the outside-in approach, that you work very well, you try to normalize Israel's relations with everybody else, and the Palestinian problem will somehow go away or will get absorbed into this entire thing. There has not been a real effort to start a peace process with the Palestinians, as has been done in most other American administrations. So I think that has been happening for a while. I don't think the Arab leaders would have been surprised, honestly speaking, because President Biden has been known for 50 years on the foreign policy scene to be a very strong supporter of Israel. In fact, every US president is a strong supporter of Israel, but many have also wanted to kickstart a peace process and appointed a special envoys, etc., who have then tried to work the ground. But here the effort has been more to follow up on what Trump had started in terms of the Abraham Accords, and then push towards the biggest normalization, which would have been Israel-Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, at the moment, it looks like all those plans are on ice.
So you don't think either Biden's personal behavior or his endorsement of the Israeli position that Islamic Jihad did the bombing, not Israel, has introduced fresh strains in his relationship either with Mahmoud Abbas or Sisi or King Abdullah?
No, I don't think so, because I think those countries know exactly what the United States-Israel equation is. Each one of them has their own concerns and their own problems, which they have to handle. And their positions will be defined by the positions taken by their people, by the anger in those countries, by the political calculations that they make. That is what is happening. And that will depend upon a lot on how Israel goes forward on the Gaza problem. I must say that there's not much love shared by anyone about Hamas. Not by Egypt, not by the others, not by the Saudis, but at the moment, Hamas seems to have grabbed the flag of the Palestinians, and therefore it's going to be very difficult for any Arab country to go against that.
Let me put that thought a little differently. Have the last 11 days created an opportunity, or at least room, for China to fish in Middle Eastern waters. After successfully bringing Iran and Saudi Arabia together, could China now want to dip its hand into the turbulent waters of Israel and Palestine?
I think China will be careful. China has tried to be very balanced in its statements. Along with Russia, they have been calling for a ceasefire. Whether they actually want to go further and mess their hands in trying to mediate, we'll have to see. That is normally not the Chinese way of doing things, but I may well be wrong. Certainly, they have a great clout at the moment, both with the Iranians as well as with the Saudis, and are trying to keep a very balanced sort of above everything position on this conflict.
So are you saying that whether or not China takes an initiative depends upon the adeptness or ineptness with which America handles the situation? China is waiting to see, only then will it take a move if it has to.
Yeah, I think everybody realizes, particularly China and Russia, that the country that really has a handle on Israel is the United States. And therefore, unless and until they feel that they are in a position to influence the Israeli decisions, I don't think they will want to come in, because then they will be seen as losing out. So ultimately, I mean, unless they might prefer to work through a regional process, through the UN, etc. I don't think they would like to come and try and displace the United States.
My last question, Mr. Sarna. Given the nature of the impact the Biden visit has had on Israel, on the Middle East, what are your worst fears? How do you see the next week or 10 days?
I think the next week or 10 days is going to be absolutely crucial. It could either all end and, things could go back to repair, dialogue, conversations, or it could go on and become a bigger thing. My worst fear is an uncontrolled or a ground offensive which causes a lot of civilian deaths. Whether or not it gets Hamas is a question which is an open question. Hamas guys are not going to be waiting there for Israeli soldiers to come in. So they will actually have to go tunnel by tunnel, house by house. So unless they get very pinpointed intelligence and get the Hamas objectives they want, I'm afraid a full-scale ground offensive will result in civilian deaths, will result in a lot of Israeli deaths, unfortunately. And there will be a huge pressure on Hezbollah, which is far stronger than Hamas. It has got far more sophisticated weaponry, far more trained soldiers or fighters to get into the act, whether or not the aircraft carriers are there. So let's just hope it doesn't go there.
Which is why the issue I raised earlier is a matter of such concern. If it is the case that there's a certain amount of green lighting that Biden did give Netanyahu as regards that ground offensive, indicating in some way behind closed doors that a certain number of civilian deaths, a certain destruction of Gaza could be acceptable provided it's within restraint, that is critical, because if it exceeds that, we could have a much, much worse problem. But if it is within those limits, Israel could get away with it.
Well, I frankly don't know what he must have said behind closed doors. We'll have to wait to see if somebody ever gets to know. So we'll just have to see from Israel's actions as to what actually transpired. But certainly in the public statements, there was a cautionary element to it. There was not a complete ban on it.
Absolutely. Mr. Sarna, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Karan. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times. And if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.